Hello, and welcome to the turbulent world with me, James M. Dorsey, as your host. Innocent Palestinians bear the brunt of Israel's Gaza war, but they are not the only victims of the conflict. So are freedoms of expression, the media, and academia in the West as well as Arab autocracies. If anything, Israeli and pro-Israeli efforts to curtail debate about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, suppress criticism of Israel, and impose a restrictive definition of anti-Semitism may be the one aspect of the Gaza war in which Israel can claim success. To be sure, nothing is more existential than the Palestinian struggle for sheer survival and to stay alive. Yet, in political terms, Palestine, Israel, and anti-Semitism have become lightning rods in what is an existential battle in defense of liberal democracy. The Gaza crisis is truly becoming a global crisis of freedom of expression. This is going to have huge repercussions for a long time to come, said Irene Khan, the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. We need freedom of expression, Mrs. Khan said, arguing that it is important for democracy, development, conflict resolution, and peacemaking. It will be harder to negotiate if you shut down one side, she added. Israel and its supporters are but one protagonist, alongside illiberals, religious nationalists, ultra-conservatives, and Arab autocrats in a campaign that predates the war, as well as former U.S. President Donald Trump's demonization of the media. I am an Emirati whose normalizing country has doubled down on its authoritarian repression following the Abraham Accords. I know countless Emirati academics and literary figures who have been slapped with indefinite travel bans, and that is the mildest form of repression yet, for objecting to normalization, criticizing Israel, and more recently, for merely wearing a keffiyeh, including non-Emiratis in this case, said sociologist Mir al-Hussein, referring to the United Arab Emirates' 2020 establishment of diplomatic relations with Israel. Mrs. al-Hussein asserted that Israel has caused us grave pains beyond what has and continues to directly affect Palestinians since the Nakba, or catastrophe, the Palestinian reference to the creation of Israel. The Israeli technology sold to authoritarian Gulf regimes have resulted in at least one publicly known execution, Jamal Khashoggi. To be completely honest, Hamas as an ideology, militant organization, does not affect us as Gulf citizens. It is the unpopular alliance with the State of Israel, however, that has caused us direct damage. Mrs. al-Hussein was referring to the 2018 killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the kingdom's consulate in Istanbul. In Western democracies, the McCarthy-style congressional grilling of American university presidents, the crackdown on student encampments in support of the Palestinians, and the penalizing of academics and company employees critical of Israel have turned Israel and Palestine into litmus tests of democracy. Rather than draw clear boundaries between legitimate debate about Israel and Zionism and anti-Semitism, efforts to curtail free-flowing discussion further blur the lines by targeting the political left, which is not immune to anti-Semitism by any stretch of the imagination, and emerging pro-Israeli anti-Semites on the far right. A report by the domestic German intelligence service warned this month that the greatest anti-Semitic threat in Germany is the intertwining of right-wing extremism and anti-Semitism. Israel anti-Semitism relations are a model of successful ambivalent relations that efficiently serve both sides, said Israeli columnist B. Michael. Separating the wheat from the chaff is complicated by confusion over the complexities of Jewish identity, the notion of a Jewish people, distinctions between Jews and Israelis, and the right to a Jewish state, reflected in left-wing efforts to frame Israel as a classical colonial and settler state. Undeniably, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict contains aspects of colonialism and a settler state. Yet Jewish history and varying notions of Jewish identity don't fit neatly into a box. Although bound by the commonality of religion and perceptions of history, Jews are a multi-ethnic, multicultural group. The complexity of Jewish identity is evidenced by the fact that atheist Jews, unlike their Christian or Muslim counterparts, often still identify as Jews, embrace the concept of a Jewish people, and have a connection, positively or negatively, to Israel. As such, Jews have a right to self-determination, even if that does not entitle them to deprive others of the same right, occupy other people's land, or denying them their humanity and dignity. The efforts to curtail debate are bolstered by widespread polarization in democracies, increasing anti-foreigner and anti-migrant sentiment, the rise of religious nationalism, and mounting distrust of political and economic elites. From the perspective of Israel and its supporters, the curtailing of debate becomes all the more urgent as Israel's war conduct strips the country of the moral high ground it successfully claimed for the longest time on the back of the Holocaust, centuries of discrimination and persecution of Jews, and the notion of tikkun olam, or repairing the world, by contributing to social justice and improvement of the world in its modern interpretation of classical rabbinic literature. Israel's campaign to silence its critics, irrespective of the cost to democratic freedom, including the freedom of choice, kicked into high gear in the mid-2000s with the emergence of the boycott, diversification, and sanctions BDS movement that threatened the moral high ground Israel claimed, or what Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called delegitimization. The core issue is not whether they are going to boycott us or not boycott us. The core issue is whether they are going to be successful in implanting in the international discourse that Israel is illegitimate as a Jewish state, said Yossi Kupferwasser, a driving force behind Israeli efforts to counter BDS. In Mr. Netanyahu's mind, the threat warranted the creation in 2006 of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs and Public Diplomacy to counter BDS. Politicians from across the Israeli political spectrum supported the move, with the ministry being headed over the years by Israeli wolf warriors like the country's current United Nations ambassador, Gilad Erdan, and the current minister, Ron Demer, to Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, a dove in Israel's contemporary environment, and now opposition leader Yair Lapid. The ministry and Israel supporters can claim successes, albeit at the expense of democratic freedom. In response to BDS, 38 of the 50 U.S. states have passed anti-boycott laws or adopted executive orders in the past decade, banning governments from doing business with or investing in companies that refuse to do business with Israel, despite a 1982 Supreme Court ruling that political boycotts were protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution, resting on the highest rung of hierarchy in First Amendment values. evangelical Republicans often sponsored the anti-boycott bills. Following Hurricane Harvey in 2017, the city of Dickinson, Texas, went as far as requiring residents who wanted relief to certify that they do not and will not boycott Israel. In a similar move, the German parliament condemned BDS as anti-Semitic, a step that fell short of the far right's call for the banning of the movement. Any country that bases its founding mythology around the Boston Tea Party and the boycott of tea, you would think that today, a few hundred years later, we would still see boycotts as a form of political speech and therefore protected by the First Amendment, said Arkansas Magazine publisher Alan Leverett. Mr. Leverett, a farmer and a publisher who describes himself as part of a family of white trash farmers, bumped up against the law when a college advertiser demanded he sign a legally required statement that he would not boycott Israel. As a free distribution magazine, Mr. Leverett's Arkansas Times is dependent on government educational and health agencies' advertisement. Most people I talked to said, "What does this have to do with the price of tea in China? It has no relevance or bearing on Arkansas. I have the right to boycott anyone I want to, and the state has no business getting involved in that, period. It's none of their business," Mr. Leverett said. There is no boycott activism in Arkansas. We're not boycotting anyone. We're just saying that you have no right to tell us what our speech should be. If we want to boycott, we can. It's a political act. It's not one I choose to take. I just object to the government saying, "We got a big wad of money over here. We'll give it to you. We'll advertise with you. But here's some conditions that you need to meet first, such as, here's the political position you need to take regarding foreign policy. For God's sake," Mr. Leverett added. Rabbi Brian Block of Little Rock's Temple B'nai Israel, Arkansas's largest synagogue, is an ardent Israel supporter. Supporting Israel is of the greatest importance to me. I could not be stronger in my opposition to boycotts of any Israeli product. However, I was appalled that a newspaper would have to sign an oath that it would not participate in any kind of political action, Mr. Block said. He noted that American freedoms are terribly important to American Jews. We wouldn't be in the magnificently enviable position in which we find ourselves were we not blessed with freedom of religion and the rights to express ourselves as we see fit. Scholars Mustafa Bayoumi and Pamela Pennock trace the origins of efforts by Israel and its backers to counter, if not quash, expressions of support for the Palestinians to the 1960s. Mr. Bayoumi argues that Islamophobia in the United States took on anti-Palestinian dimensions in the wake of the 1967 Middle East War. Mr. Bayoumi charts the targeting of Arab immigrants and pro-Palestinian activism by the National Security Agency and the FBI, as well as pro-Israeli American Jewish organizations. Mr. Bayoumi suggested that young Muslim Americans and Jewish Americans who are at the center of today's protest movements are placing Palestinian rights back in the struggle to defeat Islamophobia. Why? Clearly not because of any scriptural kinship to Palestine, contemporary identity politics, or anti-Semitism. The reason seems much more fundamental: freedom. This is not a position just for the moment. It's a position about overcoming oppression worldwide. Mrs. Pennock documented pro-Israeli attempts to counter criticism of Israel going back more than half a century that helped lay the groundwork for current efforts to curtail fundamental democratic freedom, including freedom of expression and assembly. Mrs. Pennock quoted a 1969 Anti-Defamation League report on a conference at Ohio State University of the Organization of Arab States of the U.S. and Canada that could have been written today. The political activity of the Arab students in the United States will increase significantly in the coming school year. They are beginning to display a much greater understanding of how to present their arguments to the various levels of the American public, church groups, new left, lower middle class, etc. And any successes are certain to increase their confidence and hence their activity. The situation is, however, by no means hopeless. If the proper action is taken immediately, one thing is certain: the threat on the campuses and in the churches can no longer be ignored, but must be confronted directly. Otherwise, we will lose by default, because the Arabs are making rapid gains in several areas. The report warned in a conclusion that anticipated events unfolding today. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed today's column and podcast. The turbulent world depends on the support of its readers to cover the cost of producing the column and podcast. You can contribute by clicking on Substack on the subscription button at www.jamesmdorsey.substack.com and choosing one of the subscription options. Thank you. Take care and best wishes.